now the procedure, there is also a possibility. For example, during times of appointments, where certain political appointments are made not on the basis of merit, but from a political perspective. When independent office holders are removed from office or indemitted, they are being manipulated and in performance institution, that person, that officer is not going to independently perform the office with the separation of influence from those within or those without who could have played a role in the appointment, and therefore we will forever not formations or political positions or opinions which are taken is one such area where it mirrors on obliteration of the separation of powers. Because when the legislature, for instance, and the members presiding over or chairpersons or members of the committee are vulnerable to attack or to changes or to threats from the executive and the pressures that comes with it, the oversight role of such a committee or such a house is definitely going to be compromised. And similarly, it applies to all other arms of government, both the judiciary. If the person presiding over is also feeling under threat, they will not be able to function well. And the function that is meant to be done by such a person is not going to be exercised within the constitutional confines, but there will always be a threat of some influence somewhere. Underfunding of institutions also is one such thing that is a big threat to separation of powers. And for instance, in the case of judiciary, we have judiciary which has neither purse nor sword. Therefore, if Parliament today sits and controls over the budget, which it does anyway, and allocates resources which are not commensurate with the demands of the judiciary and the budget that has been placed forward, then it definitely coerces it to compromise on certain plans and programs, and by extension, their independence is it's hampered. Article 173 of the Constitution establishes the Judiciary Fund. It requires its annual estimates that must be provided and must be directly submitted to the National Assembly. This represents now what we would say insulation of the judiciary from budgetary manipulation. But does this happen? Does this get fully implemented? The answer definitely is a no, because the budget estimate that comes will be scrutinized by the relevant committee in Parliament, and in most cases, they do not necessarily get the funding that they have submitted from their estimates. Instead, it's cut, sometimes completely, certain items are either slashed off, and therefore, in the end, their performance is compromised. Yet in practice, for example, you remember in 2020, Justice Maraga, in his public declaration of the judiciary's financial distress, it became a conversation that got across the country, where Maraga said they were in distress, and he attributed this distress to the systemic underfunding, where courts can't pay their staff, where they cannot meet their bills, where they cannot pay for their utilities or their operations generally. It definitely rations their performance, it rations justice, and its oversight mandate is completely compromised by that underfunding, and their inability will spill over even to non-players within the justice sector, because we all look up to them to provide that mandate the Constitution gives them. For the National Assembly, the implications on their budgetary allocation is also direct. If, for instance, their approval of resources that are inadequate to judiciary means it also can approve resources inadequate to other constitutional organs. And unfortunately, in this case, the Senate has got no say in budgetary implication, but the National Assembly does that. And I know I'm almost running out of time, Mercy.
You're already out of time, yes.
Um, it's quite a lot that we really need to have a conversation around. But then just to highlight on part of now the recommendations which we look up to, I've got around 6 of them. First of all, let me just highlight them because of time. We must protect judicial budgetary autonomy. We must ensure that Article 173 of the Constitution is complied with, so that this systemic underfunding is dealt with once and for all. The role of Parliament in terms of confirmation under Article 166 should be, this is the proposal I'm making, that Parliament confirmation of appointments under Article 163 should be amended to require concurrence by both the National Assembly and the Senate. This would ensure that judicial and constitutional appointments undergo substantive merit-based scrutiny insulated from executive influence. The independence of the Judicial Service Commission under Article 172 should be defended by both houses of Parliament. We need to resist legislative court-stripping proposals. Any bill that seeks to limit the jurisdiction of the superior courts over executive or legislative action must be scrutinized heavily. I don't know whether the recent judgment from the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court on the NGCDF is one such example that we should think through. We have dealt with this in various forums. We must enforce procedural integrity in parliamentary oversight. Whether we need to fast track, whether we need to truncate debates, whether we need to bypass certain committee scrutiny, or whether we need to ignore certain committee reports is very critical. In this case, we should ensure that we comply with these procedures, and by extension, we will be preserving the constitutional integrity of the committees, of the reports, of the houses generally. Last or second last, resource and protect Chapter 15 institutions. These are the horizontal accountability institutions which actually go beyond the courts. If we resource them properly, if we protect their independence, we will be able to experience their oversight mandate at their level horizontally to the arms of government. And lastly, we need to cultivate a constitutional culture in Parliament. The doctrine of separation of powers is not self-enforcing. It depends actually on the legislators, it depends on members of Parliament, it depends on those who are running the institutions, so that they play their role as representatives of the people to guard and protect the constitutional order. I believe this webinar today in itself is part of doing that culture. And lastly, as I close, Mercy, Kenya's constitution survives only through the vigilance of those entrusted to guard it. The constitution endures when leaders rise as guardians, not just as representatives of the people. Without vigilant guardianship, even the finest constitutional text will flutter. Thank you. And sorry I've taken longer than the time I had been allocated. Appreciate your listening through.
Yeah.
I am available or any comment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator. That was very well researched and very in-depth. Members, Senator, we propose to have all the presentations and then take the questions at the end. So we'll take that at the end, but you'll see some of the questions in the Q&A. Thank you. So our next presenter is Mr. James Nombi. Mr. Nombi is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. He has over 13 years of experience in law reform, legislative drafting, policy development, and legal advisory services. He has made significant contributions to legislative and institutional reforms, supporting good governance, effective public administration, and the rule of law. Mr. Nombi has a Master of Arts in Public Policy and Administration from Kenyatta University, a Bachelor of Laws from Moi University, and a postgraduate diploma from the Kenya School of Law. He also has specialized qualifications in legislative drafting from institutions in South Africa and Uganda. And currently he's serving as the Acting Secretary, Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya Law Reform Commission. Karibu, Mr. Nombi. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mercy. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Allow me to begin by thanking the Center for Parliamentary Studies and Training for inviting the Kenya Law Reform Commission to participate in this very important conversation on the principle of separation of powers and emerging threats to legislative oversight. Cpst continue to play a critical role in strengthening parliamentary democracy, constitutional governance, and institutional learning in Kenya. Colleagues, the subject before us today goes to the heart of constitutional governance and democratic accountability. Questions surrounding the relationship between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary are not unique to Kenya. Across democracy globally, institutions continue to grapple with delicate balance between independence, accountability, and cooperation. In Kenya, these questions have become even more significant following the promulgation of the Constitution of Kenya 2010, which significantly reconfigured the architecture of governance by dispersing power, strengthening oversight institutions, and entrenching constitutional checks and balances. The principle of separation of powers, as you're all aware, is rooted in the long-standing constitutional understanding captured by Montesquieu that there can be no liberty where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body. I respectively add, in the view of the Kenyan and common law context, the word judicial after the word executive, and posit that the principle of separation of powers is one of the foundational doctrines of constitutional democracy. It exists to prevent concentration of powers, safeguard liberty, and ensure accountable governance in the same person or body. Article 1 of the Constitution, colleagues, provides that the sovereign power belongs to the people and shall be accessed only in accordance with the Constitution. Again, the same Constitution and Article 1.3 provides that this power is vested in the legislature, the county assemblies, the executive and the county executives, as well as judiciary and independent tribunals. And those are founded in the vesting clauses and Article 94 of the Constitution that basically gives Parliament the legislative authority. Basically, the legislative authority is the power which Parliament make laws. Under Article 129 of the Constitution, the executive has authority to exercise their executive mandate, while the judiciary under Article 159 has a mandate to exercise the judicial authority. And the principle upon which that power is exercised under Article 159 is clearly set out. The doctrine of several powers allocates authority among the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary in order to promote accountable, prevent concession of powers, and safeguard constitutional governance. Legislative oversight is often viewed as Parliament's responsibility to oversee the executive. However, from a law reform perspective, oversight must ask a broader question, that is, are laws working as intended? In the course of this paper, we'll be providing some recommendations as to that question. The doctrine of separation of powers is sometimes misunderstood as requiring institutions to operate in isolation. Just like the Senate has mentioned, that we are looking at a three-legged stool. And therefore, these institutions cannot operate in isolation. And Parliament legislates, the executive implements, the judiciary interprets, and independent institutions perform specialist constitutional functions. Legislative authority is strengthened when institutions learn from one another. And colleagues, this is where the Kenya Law Reform Commission plays a unique role. In terms of Section 6 of the Kenya Law Reform Commission, it gives the Commission the power to keep all laws under review and recommend reforms to ensure that they remain constitutional, harmonized, just, simple, accessible, modern, and cost-effective. The Commission provides technical assistance to national account governments, undertakes comparative research study, conducts public education, and formulates bills and legislative proposals for legislative reform. Section 5(3) of the County Governments Act gives the Commission the mandate to provide technical assistance to the county governments on matters law reform. And the Commission does not legislate, neither does it implement nor adjudicate. Rather, it serves as a bridge between institutions by identifying legislative challenges, generating evidence, and translating institutional experience into legislative improvements. The Commission therefore empowers lawmakers to evaluate, amend, and hold the executive branch accountable for filling critical knowledge gaps through conducting rigorous multidisciplinary research on proposed legislation to determine its suitability. Under the current Kenya Law Reform Commission Strategic Plan 2023-2028, the Commission seeks to undertake evidence-based law reform research. And therefore, some of the proposals that will be making going forward will basically be backed by data, having undertaken the necessary research. Colleagues, in reflecting on this subject today, I wish to make observation around 6 broad threats. The principle of separation of powers. Allow me to call them threat 1 to threat 6, because they are basically 6 threats that you've identified from a law reform perspective. The first threat is the absence of post-legislative evaluation framework. The second threat to the principle of separation of powers is basically feedback loops between Parliament and legislative developments. Thirdly is the fragmented law reform and multiplicity of legislative initiatives. Fourth is a weak feedback loops between counties and national legislative processes. Constitutional effects and legislative gaps that are revealed through judicial actions. And some of the questions that I will be asked or have risen is the issues of judicial overreach or judicial activism. Finally, is the loss of institutional memory in legislative development. So in terms of threat 1, colleagues, in terms of the absence of post-enactment legislative evaluation, and we are looking at this in the context of the principle of post-legislative scrutiny, or what you call PLS. A significant gap in legislative oversight is therefore the absence of structured mechanisms for evaluating legislation after enactment. And therefore, the question that we need to ask ourselves, colleagues, is where does Parliament's legislative authority end? Does it end at the point that the president assents to legislation? Or asked differently, when Parliament enacts a legislation and provides for an objective clause, should the clause basically gives guidance to the items that the legislation is all about, or should the legislature hold the executive accountable to the broader objects for which the legislation was enacted? And of course, some of these objectives are also found in the policy framework that gave basis to the enactment of the legislation. So colleagues were saying that without systematic evaluation, Parliament may know whether a law has been implemented, but not whether it has achieved its intended objectives. Therefore, legislative gaps and intended consequences and implementation challenges may therefore persist undetected, therefore weakening the effectiveness of both the legislation and oversight. And the framework could create a platform for collaboration between Parliament, implementing agencies, county governments, the judiciary, citizens, and the Kenya Law Reform Commission. And that will ensure that legislative oversight is informed by evidence rather than assumption. In terms of Article 95 of the Constitution, Parliament has an oversight mandate. And therefore, the question we're asking ourselves is, should the oversight mandate of Parliament end or limit itself to the issues of how public money is being spent? Because, colleagues, if you look at Article 95(5)(b), again, it provides that Parliament may oversight state organs. And therefore, the point we are making here is that whereas Parliament is discharging, while Parliament is discharging its legislative mandate and oversight mandate, the oversight mandate should not limit itself to issues of how revenue is being spent by the executive, and therefore should extend to issues such as how the law that established a state organ is being implemented. And colleagues, perhaps the question to be asked is, can Parliament incorporate post-legislative scrutiny in its oversight functions? There are three available to this question. The first is that in undertaking post-legislative scrutiny as an oversight function, 95(5)(b) of the Constitution, Parliament could require that is the ministry agencies to provide regular reporting to it on the implementation of laws after its enactment. And we are proposing that the PLS should be undertaken after a period of 3 to 5 years. And this was informed by the literature review that is happening in other jurisdiction. Then secondly, Parliament will outsource or commission research on the implementation of law to external institutions, either autonomous official institutions, such as the Office of the Auditor General, just like the Senate has mentioned, or the Office of the Controller of Budget. Or this could also be done through external independent institutions, such as universities. And thirdly, Parliament will initiate and conduct its own inquiries on the implementation of selected laws by holding public hearings, collecting evidence, and conducting in-house research by staff of the House through the research unit. In terms of threat to colleagues, participants, and you're making this purely on a law reform perspective, we are of the view that there are weak feedback loops between Parliament and legislative development. And we are saying that legislative oversight is strengthened when Parliament has access to evidence-based analysis of legislative proposals. I mentioned that the Kenya Law Reform Commission is currently undertaking evidence-based law reform, so that the law reform initiatives that we are making are backed by various research considerations. Where legislative proposals are considered without adequate assessment of their personality, implementability, treatments for purpose, and long-term impact, there's a risk that Parliament may enact legislation that subsequently generates implementation challenges, disputes, and unintended consequences. To address these, colleagues, participants, the Kenya Law Reform Commission has strengthened its review methodology by assessing bills and legislative proposals against the requirements of Section 6 of the Kenya Law Reform Commission Act. And some of the considerations that we're undertaking, colleagues, are looking at issues of constitutionality, accessibility, implementability, fitness for purpose, and cost effectiveness. Following the engagement with the Justice Legal Human Rights Committee, the Commission has introduced a KLRC proposed column solution. And this is basically on the pre-publication scrutinies that the Commission often reviews. And we have the view that this approach will transform legislative review from a diagnostic exercise into a problem-solving exercise, and strengthens Parliament's capacity to make informed legislative decisions. So in terms of 33 colleagues, participants, we have identified, or we have the view that fragmented law reform and multiplicity of initiatives. And we have a growing challenge. There's a growing challenge in the increasing number of law reform initiatives being undertaken by various government agencies. And again, we have the view that without proper coordination, reform initiatives may result into duplication, overlap, competency approaches, inefficient use of public resources, and fragmentation of the legal system. This makes it difficult for Parliament to maintain visibility over the broader reform landscape and assess whether individual reform contributes to a coherent legal framework. And therefore, the Commission has sought to address this challenge through a national law reform program, or what we are calling the NLRP, which is basically a structured and systematic framework for identifying, prioritizing, sequencing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating law reform initiatives. So, colleagues, in terms of the National Law Reform Program, we have the view that this will consolidate all the law reform initiatives that are being undertaken across government agencies. And the program is designed to ensure that law reform is undertaken strategically while leaving room for urgent and ad hoc references. And this program, colleagues, will enable the Commission, and that is the Law Reform Commission, to identify legislative and regulatory reform needs arising from the national government priorities, develop governance challenges, judicial pronouncements, research initiatives, public education engagements, including the review and reform of statutory instruments. However, the Commission recognizes that the program can only achieve its full potential through sustained institutional support and collaboration. And this is where we're saying that the three branches of government cannot operate in isolation. There's therefore a need to strengthen the program through close engagement with Parliament, the executive, county governments, constitutional commissions, independent offices, and other stakeholders involved in legislative development. Colleagues, participants, with the view that a structured or strengthened national reform program will provide a more coordinated and evidence-based approach to legislative development, support legislative oversight, and contribute to the development of a coherent, responsive, and future-ready legal system. In terms of fourth threat, with the principle of separation of powers, we've identified weak feedback loops between counties and the national legislative processes. And under this, colleagues, participants, the Senate's representative, legislative, and oversight function depend upon reliable evidence regarding how legislation operates within the counties. And the question, just like we asked earlier, is should the Senate undertake a review of some of the laws that are being enacted by the county governments? And on this, colleagues, participants, we have the view that without a structured feedback from counties, national institutions may have visibility regarding implementation challenges, local governance realities, and the effectiveness of legislation in advancing objectives of devolution. Not adequately respond to county needs. Through its support to county governments, the Kenya Law Reform Commission is uniquely positioned to generate this evidence. And just like I mentioned earlier, is that in terms of what Section 5.3 of the County Governments Act, Cap 265, the counties have the obligation, and of course, in respect of the functional and institutional integrity of each level of government, to seek such assistance from the Law Reform Commission on matters law reform. Periodic devolution legislative performance reviews to assess implementation experiences, legislative effectiveness, and emerging governance challenges. And this will also be done through forums such as CAF. Question for the future is how best to balance legislative harmonization and county autonomy within the Kenyan's devolved system. While uniform approaches may promote consistency and efficiency, county-specific legislation may be necessary to respond to local circumstances. Through devolution legislative performance reviews and law reform reports, the Kenya Law Reform Commission can assess what works in practice, identify emerging best practices, and determine where harmonization, flexibility, or a hybrid approach will best advance the objectives of devolution. I'm almost winding up, Mercy. In terms of the fifth threat, this is the second last threat, is the issue of constitutional defects and legislative gaps revealed through judicial interpretation. I mentioned these are the questions that have always been asked about issues such as judicial overreach, or what others will call judicial activism. Courts increasingly identify constitutional defects, legislative gaps, and implementation challenges that may not have been apparent during the legislative processes. The lessons arising from judicial interpretations are not systematically captured and so translated into legislative reform. The same constitutional and legislative deficiencies have persisted, resulting in recurring litigation, legal uncertainty, and weakened public confidence in the law. Recognize this challenge, colleagues, participants. The Honorable Attorney General has an interagency and interministerial committee to review legislation affected by judicial pronouncements, and has designated the KLRC as both the chair and the secretariat. Judicial review and law reform should not be viewed as competing functions. Courts identify challenges through interpretations. The Kenya Law Reform Commission, together with Attorney, translate those lessons into legislative improvements. The Commission is also developing law reform reports that document the problem being addressed, evidence considered, consultations undertaken, competing stakeholder interest, policy options evaluated, and the rationale for the chosen intervention. And this is where the principle of judicial rational difference comes in. This way, colleagues, participants, what courts are often required to infer or imagine regarding legislative intent can increasingly be drawn from an authoritative reform report, strengthening both legislative quality and judicial interpretation. The last threat that we identified, colleagues, participants, is the issue of loss of institutional memory in legislative development. Legislative oversight is weakened when institutions lack access to evidence, analysis, and policy reasoning that inform legislative choices. The Kenya Law Reform Commission is responding to this challenge through the development of numbered law reform reports. And these reports, colleagues, participants, will serve as a common institutional reference point for Parliament, the executive, the judiciary, county governments, and citizens. The reports will document the complete law reform journey, beginning with the identification of the problem, as you're aware, that the development of legislation must be informed by the problem that the legislation seeks to address. And therefore, the evidence demonstrating the existence of the problems, they will also capture stakeholder consultation and undertaking, competing interests and perspectives presented by different stakeholders, and the implementation experiences that formed the reform process. Again, the reports will further contain doctrinal legal analysis, literature review, comparative studies, and assessment of existing legal policy and institutional frameworks. Importantly, colleagues, participants, these reports will also evaluate the various policy and legal options available to address the identified problem, analyze the advantages and disadvantages of each option, and explain the rationale for the recommended course of action. So the point you're making here, colleagues, participants, is akin to what is provided for under the Statutory Instrument Act, Cap 2A. That when developing such instruments, they often the requirement for RIA, and that is the regulatory impact assessment, or statement as others would call it. And therefore, RIA ought to give you the two options. That is the regulatory option and the non-regulatory option. And therefore, the question that needs to be asked is whether to develop a law when the problem that has been identified can adequately be addressed through certain administrative measures that have been identified. And this report, colleagues, participants, will also identify the most appropriate reform instruments required to address the problem. In some instances, the solution may require a bill, others, a statutory instrument, administrative arrangement, policy intervention, or advisory opinion may be sufficient. The reports will therefore ensure that legislative reform is guided by evidence rather than assumption. For Parliament, this will provide an evidence base for legislative review, amendment, and oversight. In conclusion, I see the moderator is asking me to conclude. The central message I wish to leave today, colleagues, participants, is that separation of powers requires both independence and collaboration. Independence protects constitutional boundaries. Collaboration ensures that institutions learn from one another. Effective legislative oversight depends upon this balance. Therefore, the balance we're talking about is the balance between independence and collaboration. As we move forward, colleagues, participants, let's strengthen the partnership between Parliament, county assemblies, the executive, the judiciary, and the citizens we serve. Let's uphold the independence of our institutions while embracing collaboration that promotes learning, accountability, and continuous improvement. Together, let us ensure that every law is informed by experience, guided by evidence, and refined through effective legislative oversight so that our legal framework remains responsive, practical, and beneficial to all Kenyans. The Kenya Law Reform Commission will continue to advance this vision by ensuring that the experiences of citizens and institutions are systematically captured, analyzed, and translated into sound and implementable legislation. Through its mandate under Section 6 of the Kenya Law Reform Commission Act, the Commission supports legislative oversight by promoting lawmaking as a continuous circle of learning, evaluating, and improvement. thereby helping to bridge the gap between policy intent, implementation, and the lived realities for the people of Kenya. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nombi. That was very enlightening. Thank you very much. Participants, continue posting your questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll take them after our next presenter. Our presenter is someone most staff in Parliament know. He's a former colleague. We have Honorable Dr. Justice Johnson Okello. Dr. Okello is a judge of the Court of Appeal, a distinguished legal practitioner with over 28 years of experience in the legal profession. He has a law's degree from the University of Nairobi and a master's degree from the University of London. Before his appointment to the Court of Appeal, Dr. Okello served as the Director Legal Services in Parliament, the Parliamentary Service Commission, and he also previously served as in the Kenya Law Reform Commission and the Office of the Attorney General. He is widely recognized for his expertise in legislative drafting, law reform, public law, and institutional governance, as well as his commitment to constitutionalism, integrity, and the rule of law. Karibu, Judge. Please take us through your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mercy. If you don't get me clearly, please let me know. And once again, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Cpst. Thank you, participants. Thank you, my co-presenters, Honorable Hilary Sigei and James Nombi, who did pupillage under me when I was at the Kenya Law Reform Commission. I'm glad you are growing now to be the CEO of Kenya Law Reform Commission. Karibu. And to all colleagues from Bunge, it's a pleasure being here. I just moved from the court to join this session. I'm dressed in some funny attire, so you'll forgive me for that. Having said that, allow me to pick it up from where Honorable Sigei, Senator Sigei, and Nombi have left. I want to give this discourse a holistic picture so that we can see where we are as a country. And let me start by stating that the theory of separation of powers is a central feature in the Constitution of Kenya. It is central. In fact, it is a foundational doctrine of constitutional governance. It is designed to prevent the concentration of authority and to protect liberty. Now, if you look at the Constitution, our Constitution, you discover that we have adopted the doctrine of separation of power, which is what I would call absolute. Absolute in the sense that we have three arms of government. That is the executive, we have the legislature, and we have the judiciary. And my colleagues have spoken to this. And all these institutions have their functions and powers well prescribed by the Constitution. Their roles are well defined in the Constitution. And we have taken one further step that has confounded most of Commonwealth jurisdictions, those who are colonized by the British, because the British don't have this. We have a system where no member of either organ of government belongs to the other. So we have the executive members headed by the president down to the cabinet not being members of parliament. And that is why nowadays, if you are keen about our parliamentary processes, bills are published by Parliament. It is Parliament that takes bills to the President for assent. It's no longer the Attorney General. It is no longer the ministers. It is Parliament, so that the President and the Executive are not members of Parliament. Number two, there are no members of Parliament who are members of the Executive. And so, once again, you can see that ministers or members of Parliament no longer sit in the cabinet. In fact, if you look at our ministers, we call them cabinet secretaries. They are not politicians, and they are not supposed to be politicians. Then we have the judiciary, again, that is independent. And so we have the doctrine of separation of power, an absolute doctrine of separation of power, forming our foundational doctrine of the constitutional governance in Kenya. When we were starting, my friend Mercy made it clear that Kenya is a constitutional democracy. And I want to agree with Mercy so that we are on the same page. We are not a presidential democracy. We are not a parliamentary democracy. Those exist in other jurisdictions. We are a constitutional democracy, meaning that there is a system of government which has a fundamental law that allocates powers to various organs of government and places limitations on the exercise of these powers. So the executive cannot do whatever they are doing outside the constitutional limitations. The legislature cannot do whatever they are doing outside the constitutional limitations. The judiciary cannot do whatever they are doing outside the constitutional limitations. And so this constitution, which as Kenyans we bequeath ourselves, if you look at the preamble, we are saying we, the people of Kenya, have bequeathed ourselves this constitution. So if you look at that constitution, it puts limits on three parts, organs of the state, balancing all the three organs so that they can work well. But at the center of this balancing of power, at the center of this balancing of power are the people. The people are the center of this balancing of power. We do not want an executive that will do things that hurt the people. We do not want a legislature that will do things that hurt the people. We do not want a judiciary that will do things that will hurt the people. So the people are the center of this. And so if you look at the principle of separation of power, we are saying, one, we have separation of functions of government organs. That's one. Number two, we have division of power principle. Power is divided among the arms of government. Number three, we have the principle of checks and balance, so that we are balancing the roles and functions of each arm. We also have a fourth principle, which still falls under the doctrine of separation of power, but many of us don't speak about it. The principle of devolution. In some countries like the United States of America, countries like Nigeria, they talk of the principle of federalism. In our context, we are talking of the principle of devolution. Under this principle, we have distinguished between powers assigned to the national government and powers reserved to county government. That's important. And so as I proceed to speak to the topic, we must have that at the back of our mind, that the principal function of this constitution, being a basic document of democracies, is that it has 3 pillars of government, and these pillars of government, their powers, roles, functions are prescribed by the Constitution. And so we are a constitutional democracy. And if you look at Article 1 of the Constitution, and the Nombi spoke to this, it starts with very powerful words. I don't know if you have sat down to read this word and think through them. It starts by saying, all sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya. All sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya. So you seated there, I seated where I am, we are the people of Kenya. The sovereign power belongs to us. And then the Constitution says, this sovereign power shall be exercised in accordance with this Constitution. And so we cannot go outside the Constitution. Even when we talk of oversight, it must be within the rubrics of the Constitution. Even when we talk of law reform, lawmaking, it must be within the rubrics of the Constitution. This is the basic doctrine that governs how we conduct our day-to-day business. If you look at Article 1(2), sub-Article 2, it says, the people may exercise their sovereign power either directly or through democratically elected representatives. And so the point is, this sovereign power that we have, we the people, is delegated to parliament and county assemblies. If you look at 1.3, it says, 138, it says, all legislative powers are given, donated, are delegated to parliament and county assemblies. If you look at Article 1.3b, it says, the executive power, again, which belongs to the people, it says, all executive power or authority derives from the people of Kenya. Then it is vested or delegated to the national executive, and of course, in another article, to the county executive. Now, I want you to note this, that we are talking of a national executive. We are not talking of a president. Unlike the United States of America, who also observe the doctrine of separation of powers, in their case, they are very clear. The executive power inheres in the president. In our case, the executive power is vested in the national executive, which includes the president, the deputy president, and the rest of the cabinet. Those are the exact 120. Then we have the third limb. The third limb says, and that is Article 1.3c. If you look at Article 1.3c, it says that the judicial authority, again, is derived from the people and vested and shall be exercised in the judiciary and independent tribunals. Important. And therein, you can see, colleagues, what we mean by the doctrine of separation of power. We do not want to concentrate all power in one institution. We do not want to concentrate on power in one person. And my colleagues have spoken to this. Recognizing this, one of our early writers, John Locke, has observed that it may be too great a temptation to humanity for the same person who have the power of making laws to have also in their hands the power to execute them, whereby they may exempt themselves from obeying the laws they make and suit the law, both its making and execution, to their own private advantage. separation of powers. I think again, Senator Segei and also Nombi spoke about Charles Montesquieu, and he said, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistracy, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power is not separated from the legislative and executive power. Colleagues, that is the essence of the doctrine of separation of powers. And so in this context, the legislature make laws, they oversight, and they represent the people. The executive execute the laws. They come up with policies and execute the laws. The judiciary is there to interpret the law. And so these three arms of government intercheck each other. So the judiciary has oversight over the parliament and the legislature with a view to protecting the public. So Lord Bryce has observed that the ultimate fountain of power, popular sovereignty, always flows full and strong well up from its deep source, but it is thereafter diverted into many channels, each of which is so confined by skillful constructed embankments that it cannot overflow. The watchful hand of the judiciary being ready to mend the bank at any point where the stream threatens to break through. That is the role of the judiciary. Having said that, how is this doctrine realized in Kenya? Have we achieved it? And Mercy, I'm winding up because my colleagues have already spoken so much.
3 minutes.
Don't be cited for contempt. Yeah, okay. But let me just wind up by saying this, that having looked at the doctrine of separation of power and the Kenyan context, we are in agreement that Kenya, we have absolute doctrine of separation of power. Of course, there are places they intertwine. For example, the president still has veto powers of vetoing the legislation if they are not happy and all that. But how has separation of powers, how has it affected legislative oversight? That's my last statement. The first problem we are facing with the doctrine of separation of power in our current context, in paper we have a good constitution. In paper we have the doctrine of separation of power. But first and foremost, the powers are not equally shared. Whereas the constitution is very clear how it is supposed to be done. But if you look at those powers, you will find that some organs are more powerful. And so the executive dominance, the concept of executive dominance is so much alive. Executive dominance has made sure that Parliament is not able to pass laws independently. In fact, and Senator can confirm this, that when the executive wants a particular law, people will be whipped and will be whipped. And they'll have to pass law. So the issue of executive dominance is so real that has affected legislative oversight. Secondly, the issue of executive privilege and non-compliance. Executive privilege and non-compliance. Executive has continuously asserted executive privilege to block legislative work. If, for example, a member brought a bill that the executive is not happy with, in most cases, that bill might not see the light of day. We have very few bills that have come. And even where the bills have been brought by the executive and the members, the parliament, that's National Assembly and Senate, tries to amend to bring in things they think are pro-public, they have always been overruled. In fact, we normally say, let us just pass it, then we'll amend it later. So executive privilege, dominance, working together executive privilege have made sure that legislative work is compromised. This also deals with non-compliance. The executive, rarely does the executive comply with parliamentary resolutions. This is a fact. So many times Parliament has passed resolutions, but they are never implemented. You've seen it with the Senate and governors. You've seen it with the National Assembly and the national government. We've seen it with county assemblies and legislature. So executive privilege and non-compliance. Number 3, state capture. This is seen very much in the area of vetting of state officers and also legislation that is enacted. How many times have we seen Parliament during vetting has earmarked one person and said, this one does not qualify, but that report is still passed, and that person Parliament was questioning is actually appointed. State capture. Conflict of interest. Again, this compromises legislative oversight. I was excited the other day when I saw the Speaker of the National Assembly, I think, ordered that the T amendment bill be debated afresh, because one member who was an interest did not declare their interest. And I think they're going back to debate it. Conflicts of interest. Legislature has compromised its legislative oversight by not observing the conflict of interest edicts. So we have very many questions. I know I will say this and I might not be popular, but I'll say it. Why are we giving the legislature money for CDF and the World Development Funds? That is joining two works of oversight and implementation together. So who is going to oversight the other? That's conflict of interest. Political influence and oversight capture, very much alive. So the doctrine cannot work when we have a clear case of political influence and oversight capture. Institutional capture and loyalty politics. How many times have we seen voting being done in terms of things being approved, total oblivious of what the public needs? Institutional capture and loyalty politics. I always give this example. You remember the finance bill, where public said we don't want ABCD. Parliament, in their wisdom, passed it, and then the president, because of the riots, did not assent to it. Then when the president was announcing not assenting to it, who was standing behind the president? The same members who passed the bill, and they were clapping. Institutional capture and loyalty politics. Mercy, I'm finishing. On the judiciary, we have the issue of judicial overreach and judicial activism. These have also made it difficult for the separation of powers, and it has affected legislative oversight. Because time without number, we have cases where the judiciary, in making the decisions, have interfered with the workings of the legislature, have interfered with the working of the workings of the executive. And so the issue of judicial overreach and judicial activism. Doctrine, the last is doctrine of colorable legislation. This is what I call the doctrine of fraud on the Constitution. I think I can say without fear of contradiction that sometimes we have had fraud on the Constitution from the executive and from the legislature. Sometimes we pass laws that are fraudulent on the Constitution, and then we allow the judiciary to come in late in the day. And even the judiciary, we are not to spare. We cannot be spared, because we have also had that fraud on the Constitution. How do you declare something unconstitutional? Then you give people time to rectify. So they continue doing unconstitutional things and all that. So the doctrine of colorable legislation, fraud on the Constitution. And lastly, the public. I think the public, we have also made the doctrine of separation of power and legislative oversight very weak, because the public, when oversight comes up, we start saying, huyu ni mtu wetu, huyu ni mtu wetu. Then when it comes to elections, you elect depending on your ethnicity and all that. It has weakened legislative oversight. So I can conclude that yes, our constitution is very clear on separation of power. We have one of the best constitution in terms of the doctrine of separation of powers, but our culture as a people actually paralyzes legislative oversight. It's a doctrine that is marred by impracticability, violation of the organic unity of the government, and it has created mutual distrust and enmity between the three branches of government. And one can sum up the importance of this theory that it forms the backbone of our constitution, and yet we are not living it. We are all called upon, Kenyans, we are all called upon as the judiciary, the legislature, the executive, to stand up and defend the constitution. I so submit.
Thank you, Daktari. Thank you very much. That was very elaborate. So I see some questions in the chat box, so I'll read out as they appear on my screen. So the first one is from Mr. Alex Ogutu. It's to Senator Sigei. He says, how suitable is our presidential veto as provided under Article 115 of the Constitution in safeguarding Parliament's lawmaking powers? And he proceeds to ask whether by the president invoking this power, there is a breach of separation of powers. So Senator Sigei, you can take that one.
Thank you, Mercy. I'll try to straight answer the question, one of which a portion of it has already been answered by the comments by Justice Okello in terms of one of the bills that pursuant to Article 115, the President exercised his veto power and sent it back to Parliament. But then the question is, from President Uhuru and President William Ruto, have they exercised that power under Article 115? And the answer is yes. In their reservations on the bills they sent back to Parliament, recalling the fact that Justice Okello has clearly told us that ours is not a purely presidential or a parliamentary system. Ours is a hybrid of the two. Has then this Article 115 provided an avenue for the executive to participate in the lawmaking process? And the answer is partially yes and no, because when you look at, the first one that Justice Okello has mentioned is about the finance bill. I don't want to speak to it any longer. But to just merely defend the legislature, the mere act of standing beside the president when he is sending back the bill to Parliament, I don't know whether we would interpret it to mean that the National Assembly has already ceded their power to the executive. Well, of course, it can be interpreted to mean yes, but the conflict of interest bill that the president, and you recall that, Mercy, we dealt with this as JLAC, and it was actually the recommendations that came from the Senate that led to the exercise of that power by the president, and the bill was returned to Parliament with a lot of reservations, including even the text on how certain clauses in the bill were to be drafted. And the back and forth led to an acceptance by Parliament on the reservation by the president. And his justifications were that he didn't meet the threshold that he required, whereas on our part as Parliament, we had said that that was too much and some of it was unconstitutional. So we have, on the one hand, permitted the executive to play the role of legislature by some of those reservations. But on the other hand, what Justice Okello told us about the conflict of interest, well, the latest is the Speaker's declaration that the T-bill be debated afresh. And also now the majority, the tyranny of numbers. Let me just use the cliche that we've lately been treated to. Unfortunately, by doing that, the impact on the independence of parliament and separation of powers has largely been affected. And so I would say, even though that is a constitutional provision, how we utilize return of a bill by the president with reservation is what determines whether we will still maintain our independence as parliament. Because when you look at the term of Uhuru Kenyatta, the bills that Uhuru Kenyatta sent back to parliament includes the higher educational loans bill, if I think I recall, and his reasoning was that it was not going to protect the fund if we reduce the interest that was chargeable, as well as waiving them. The fund will deplete and it will not be available for future applicants. And secondly, the one that was also now in the image of the public was the parliamentary pensions bill. Remember the one that the members of parliament gave themselves 100,000 out of once you exit as pension. It created a lot of outcry from among the parliamentarians, but from the public image, it was the right thing to do, because to him that was quite unfair for parliamentarians to do it. But it is because of part of what we had said earlier on in my presentation. I had made the argument that there has been created some level of interference by the governance of the legislative process, where we either limit the debate, we limit participation, we limit acceptance and accommodation of reviews and submissions from public in the course of our legislative mandate. And by extension then, we allow it to pass within limited time and can be challenged after passage, meaning that independence and the mandate is largely affected. And therefore, I would agree with Agutu that, this exercise of Article 115 is, on the one hand, protective of the public when reservations are justified, and on the other hand, it interferes with the mandate, the exclusive mandate of Parliament in legislation. Thank you, Mercy. I hope I have attempted to respond to Alex.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I see also Mr. Mwiruri had asked a similar question on 115 and Article 115, so that has been answered. Then we have Mr. Jacob Ikoel. What is the place of the majority party or coalition party in terms of oversighting their own government, or party for that matter, since they are supposed to be defending the government agenda in parliament? Does this conflict require legislative review of laws to give parliamentarians absolute oversight role? So any of the panelists can take this one.
Mercy, could you take back again the question?
Again? All right. Yes. Mr. Jacob is asking, what is the place of the majority party or coalition party in terms of oversighting their own government or party, because they're supposed to be defending government agenda in parliament? He then asked, does this conflict require legislative review of laws to give parliamentarians absolute oversight role? So he's asking about the majority.
Okay, thank you.
Party.
Thank you. I don't think we need to introduce or amend any law. We have, in my view, actually over-legislated in Kenya. There is no aspect of any governance that has got no law. And therefore, I don't think we need to introduce any law to give Parliament executive oversight role against the executive or otherwise. And to the extent that we are talking about the majority members of parliament or the majority party seeking to defend the position of the executive and the party that probably sponsored them into being in parliament, there is, of course, the conflict that, remember, Justice Okello made reference to, because where there is an interest by the executive over a certain law that they want to pass, they will whip the members to make sure that they get the majority to pass it. what I would propose to do is we engage at the level of those who are in such, for instance, leadership position, so that we objectively engage. Because on the one hand, I have got an agenda to deliver on the part of the majority and the ruling party that I support, but at the same time, I am in parliament to legislate. Legislation, we always say we should be doing it for posterity. Do it in the context of I am in government today, I am with the majority. Tomorrow, I am not in this same government, or I'm not in the majority. There is another government that is in place. Does the law that we pass today going to serve only for the 5 or 10-year period? It should be a law that is for posterity. And that is why it boils down to individual membership and the independence of these institutions, because it does not necessarily mean that you cannot argue against your government. When you are arguing against a government on objective issues, I am sure you will equally be protecting the independence of parliament and at the same time able to prosecute the interest that you are seeking to push for the ruling majority party in parliament. Thank you.
Dr. Kello, you?
Yeah. Yes. I think I totally agree with Senator Sigei. Probably what I would say is, and this applies to all of us, we need, as a country, to reorient ourselves with the new constitutional framework. The problem we are facing today, and this applies to virtually every person, is we are 15 years down the line, 13 years down the line after, in the process of implementing the current constitution, we still find the relics of the old governance structure applying to us, or we still feel like we want to apply those old relics where we were talking of opposition party, we are talking of the government in parliament and all that. And I think if we reach a point of appreciating the new principles that are in the Constitution, the principles that are in the Constitution, then we'll not be worried about majority or minority party. Remember, one of the things that makes the clarification of minority majority party not of any should not compromise our members of parliament is this. Remember, the executive, unlike the old constitution, today the executive cannot dissolve parliament. Members of parliament are members until their 5-year term ends. And even during the time when they are campaigning, they are still entitled, they are still members of parliament until the day elections are done. So it simply means that parliament has that independence. And so we expect members of parliament to use their personal, that independence to make a determination and an informed decision on whether to support a particular position or not. So if parliament feels that, if a member feels that, yes, I'm a member of the majority party, but I don't agree with this, then they can always vote against it. And that has happened severally, not once. The only sad thing is, remember, is democracy. The minority will have their say, but the majority will have their day. These are some of the realities we must live with. But I believe that our constitution, the way it is framed, it has given independence to our members of parliament to exercise their independent mind and independent view on how they should be able to vote on a motion, on a law, on any provisions and all that. That does not mean that necessarily parliament, whether majority party, must support the government of the day. The constitution protects them. And for me, Parliament, the Constitution still gives us that opportunity of members of Parliament standing up for what they believe in. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. I think we have time for one more question. I see Mr. John Moiruri. He says that Parliament invests enormous energy in passing legislation, but does not take the time to check whether the laws have been enacted. He refers to post-legislative scrutiny, which he says Parliament has not treated as a priority and has no dedicated budget. So his question is, does the panel see that the absence of systematic post-legislative scrutiny is a blind spot that lets poorly performing laws and the executive bodies meant to implement them thereby escape accountability? Yes, any of the panelists can take this one.
If you allow, I
Yes.
could pick.
Yes, proceed.
And any other person can bring it in. First and foremost, let's agree, Parliament doesn't have, Parliament has never stopped to follow up to ensure that a law, at least under the current constitution, Parliament has ensured that a law is, once they enact a law, it is actually enacted into law. Why? Because the Constitution has a mechanism of making sure that once Parliament has passed a bill, there are timelines within which the President is to assent to it. There are timelines within which the President has to get back if he are not happy, and Senator he has spoken to it. And there are timelines of what happens if the President just forgot about it. The Constitution is clear, the law becomes effective. Now, the challenge comes in the oversight part of it. And I think as much as we are talking about not having a post-legislative scrutiny framework and all that, Parliament operates by way of committees. These committees are normally designed in terms of departmental. Nothing stops these parliamentary committees from ensuring that laws that have been passed and are falling within their docket are actually implemented, and nothing stops them using Article, I think, 129, the one where Parliament can summon or invite anyone. Nothing stops Parliament from summoning or inviting any member of the executive and asking them, why haven't you enacted this law? Why haven't you implemented this law? Why haven't you drafted the regulations? And during my few years in Parliament, there are committees that were actually doing it. They were literally summoning and asking the executive, why are you not implementing this law? And so this is happening. Probably it may need to be done in a more structured format, but I humbly submit that we have systems and structures in Parliament that can ensure and oversight legislation as enacted, and even see whether it is being enacted properly. And if it is not enacted properly, they have the power to ask for proposed amendments. What can we amend to make the law work properly? Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. I think we are now out of time, though I see we still have some very engaging questions in the panel. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But I think it's also interesting that the High Court is now reading the judgment on the impeachment of the former Deputy President. So if ever there was a matter that demonstrates how the three arms of government come together, from oversight to checking state officers, this is a good example. So we look forward to see how the High Court will resolve the question of the limits of judicial review. So thank you very much, Senator Sigei, Mr. Nombi, Justice Okello. Thank you very much for taking the time and for the very eloquent presentations we have received this morning, running into the afternoon. We are grateful for the time. So at this point, I hand over back to Dr. Waka for the rest of the session. Thank you, participants, for staying, and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Mercy, and thank you everyone else who participated. Dr. Okello, we miss you in the team. I know you're doing a good job in the bench. Thank you very much. Let's listen to the judgment on the other side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for running through a very good session. We have quite a number of issues that came out: judicial manipulation of procedure, ignorance or ignoring props of parliament, manipulation of personnel, funding from CK. We had threats, quite a number. One of them will be threats to oversight, and we looked at post-legislative scrutiny. We also looked at in-year reporting from the, that's a very interesting one, in-year reporting, then feedback loops and problems along feedback from Nombi, and then Justice Okello. A very good aspect, Montesquieu, John Madison, John Locke, John Locke, and the rest. And so I believe we've had a long and good issue. State capture issues are come out. Questions of doctrine of fraud, a very interesting one. So and for the participants who participated in this, I want to say thank you on behalf of the Executive Director of the Center for Parliamentary Studies and Training, thank you and say asanteni sana. And I want to give back to Ms. Waya to just close with housekeeping rules, and then we can close. Ms. Waya.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Waka, and thank you, everybody. We shall upload the recording of this webinar on our YouTube page. So we appreciate everybody for taking time to sit through and listen to our speakers from start to finish. We wish you a good day and a blessed week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Waiwa.